U.S. sanctions on Venezuela cost the country more than $30 million a day, and yet the U.S. has recognized an unelected representative from their National Assembly as the new president. Today on Roundtable Perspective, former priest Charlie Hardy joins me in examining the current crisis in Venezuela, the recent past, and the effect of U.S. sanctions on the general population. Welcome to Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Lee Artz. I'm joined by my guest today, Charlie Hardy, to discuss the experience contemporary and the recent past in Venezuela. Glad to have you here.
It's good to be here. Really a privilege.
I think the best thing to do is start a little bit with your background. You were a Maryknoll priest. You were in Caracas, the capital city of Venezuela, for 20 years. Maybe you can tell us when to when.
It was actually, I lived in Venezuela about 26 years.
Okay.
And was what was called an associate priest with Maryknoll, a group of missionaries based out in New York. But our mission wasn't to make conversions. It was really to live among the people, and that's where I had the privilege of living in a cardboard shack for 8 years. And but in 1994 I got married, which means I could no longer function as a Catholic priest. And then 2011 came back to the United States, got involved in politics. 2014.
So you were in Venezuela from 94 to 2011?
1985
okay.
to 2011. And then I've been back there pretty regularly since then.
And your book, Cowboy in Caracas, North American's memoir of the Venezuela's democratic revolution, is based upon your years from the time you lived in a cardboard shack until after you were married. And
right. I wanted the title to be Venezuela, the World's Best Kept Secret of Democracy. But if you've ever published a book, it's the publisher gets to choose the title, what it looks like, even does some editing inside and so on.
It sounds like you're a guy on a horse with spurs or something.
Yes, well, if you're from Wyoming, you're a cowboy. Okay. I think I've only been on a horse maybe 10 times growing up in Cheyenne. But that was the title. I said I wanted to use that for another book someday, and he said you can find another title for that book someday. But I'd like to go a little bit more in detail about the experience of living in Venezuela, but I'd like to put in the context of what is happening today.
Yes.
I just came back from Venezuela at the beginning of February, and the 10th of January, President Nicolas Maduro was inaugurated. And I heard a word that I had never heard before. Having lived in Latin America for so many years, you could say I'm bilingual, but that doesn't mean I know every word in the English dictionary or every word in the Spanish dictionary. And so I heard a word, Guaido, and I didn't know what Guaido was. I thought, animal, vegetable, mineral, what is Guaido? And it turns out that not even 1 in 5 Venezuelans had ever heard the term before either. It was a new word, Guaido. And then on the 23rd of January, a person by the name of Juan Guaido stood up in a plaza in Caracas and said, I declare myself the president of Venezuela. And immediately the United States recognized him as president of Venezuela. So I hope that gives people something of a perspective. Something strange is happening, where a person who is practically unknown in a country
declared himself president.
And it's then recognized by the United States and other countries almost immediately. And so I would like to talk about Juan Guaido and Charlie Hardy. But don't think about Charlie Hardy. I mean, think about what was happening around me.
One of the argument, the reason it's in the news today is Venezuela's in this humanitarian crisis, and Guaido is going to be the savior, and U.S. humanitarian aid will rescue that. And in that mix is a critique of the changes that have happened over the last 20 years since the election of Hugo Chavez. And the reason I thought your book was interesting and your experiences, you're living on both sides of those changes, and you've had an experience that most Americans don't get to witness or hear. So one of the things I'd like you to do is, I mean, you talked about living in a cardboard shack, so Chavez gets elected in 98, 99, and then there's a series of changes that have happened, and I would suspect that you've witnessed some of those changes, which would give some context to this Guaido phenomenon.
Okay, and I think it would be helpful in that, even going back further, when Juan Guaido was a year and a half old, eating baby food, I was living in a cardboard shack and seeing children with bloated stomachs, with parasites, and the people around me, that was what we experienced. When he was 5 and a half, I was in a hospital morgue in Caracas where I saw naked bodies of young people just strewn on the floor because there was no place else to put them. That had been shot by the military, basically. When he was 6 and a half, I slept in the cemetery several nights with people from the barrio, 68 bodies in garbage bags at that particular site. How many more places there were like that? We don't know. Killed by the government? Now what I'm saying is our experience in the barrio was quite different from this little kid at that time. When he was like 8, 9 years old, I remember seeing a newspaper with pages totally censored. There was
I
nothing
think
on
we
them.
have a copy of those newspapers.
Yeah,
Yes.
and I mean,
I just want to stop because given the lack of context that the American public has, when you talk about the Venezuelan government and government shooting the population, I want to make it crystal clear that you're talking about the government before Chavez was elected. So when you're saying the Venezuelan government did this, you're not talking about the government now, you're talking about the government before Chavez was elected
Right.
in 98. The conditions of starvation, the conditions of life, the brutality is not something that exists now, but it was something that
and this was the
prior.
so-called wonderful democracy that
yes.
Venezuela
That
had.
what Guaido and the U.S. wants to return to is pre-98.
If you would look when President Chavez was elected in 1998, what happened, let's put it in U.S. terms, let's imagine the next election, the Democratic Party gets 2.5% of the vote for presidency, the Republican Party gets 2.5%, and you're elected president of the United States. I mean, that's how shocking it was when Chavez came in. But you can imagine, I mean, because the Social Democrats and Christian Democrats had dominated the scene up to that time. And so they'd have an election, but really it wasn't a democracy in my mind. So I use that comparison though. What were the people in the barrio experiencing and what was Juan Guaido experiencing during those years, who ends up studying at George Washington University, for example, in the United States. And he became involved, he was very much against Chavez when he got elected. Now, he would not remember the things that I was mentioning. And in 2007, he was at the forefront of a demonstration when the government was not going to renew the license of a television station, RCTV, and he was out picketing. They're taking away freedom of expression. Well, the owner of that station was Marcel Granier, who was the owner of that newspaper that was censored some years ago when he was 9 years old, and he doesn't remember that. That channel, by the way, was turned into a public service channel instead of renewing the license.
And the reason it didn't get renewed, I think it's important to point out, again, it's when we get the information in the U.S. press, there is no context. There was a coup against an elected president in 2002, and RCTV was the channel where the coup leaders gathered, and Garnier was one of the central people that participated in the coup. So, but they kept their license. Can you imagine if ABC had launched a coup against one of our presidents, and then afterwards they just said, well, that's okay, and you keep your license, and at the end of that period, it was not renewed, so it wasn't like it was removed. It just was not renewed for reasons.
Right.
So I just want to put some things in context. So.
And something else in context, by the way, talking about Venezuela and humanitarian aid and so on. About a year ago, I was in Venezuela for about 3 weeks at the time. I came back to the United States and I was in Portland, Oregon. I saw more homeless people in 3 hours in Portland, Oregon than I had seen on the streets of Caracas in 3 weeks. Now, this morning, walking down the streets of Chicago, I saw more people begging in 3 minutes.
Yeah.
than I had seen during the month of December and January when I was in Caracas. There is a need for humanitarian aid to the United States. We get a very distorted picture of what is happening in the world
So
today.
it would be helpful, because you said you were in Venezuela this year. I think it would be useful to talk about, to give some understanding of what conditions had changed from the bloated stomachs and the pigs in the cemetery to, say, 2005, 2006, up till Chavez's death in 2013. Had things changed? And then let's compare that with the conditions that Venezuela faces now.
But even now, when you think the government has built like 2.5 million homes for people, the people who lived in those cardboard shacks where I lived, they have decent apartments. They're living in houses, yes. And much of that has happened since Chavez's death. Maduro, to follow President Chavez would be like, I suppose St. Peter did a good job, but following Jesus, he doesn't exactly compare. Yeah. And something similar, trying to follow Chavez. And yet the perception in the United States of both Chavez and Maduro, I was in a Catholic church a week and a half ago, and since I've been a kid, when I was a little boy, the nicest place to fall asleep was at church on Sunday. The Mass was in Latin, Catholics don't talk in church, my parents couldn't argue, it was just peaceful. When I became a teenager, I started falling asleep during the sermons, even though they were in English, and I have carried on that tradition to this day. But a week and a half ago, I'm there, and I am dozing off, and I hear Hugo Chavez, which woke me up, the deacon preaching, and then I thought, did I hear Hitler? And so I waited. You know, we Catholics don't stand up at church and say things like, amen, and we don't say, what did you say? But I was just sizzling. And when I waited and left as one of the last people, and I asked this deacon, did I hear you say Hugo Chavez? And who else? And he mentioned Hitler, and I don't know who else, that Chavez kind of as a current day example, maybe he was thinking of Maduro. And I decided what I would say was, you know, I know where I was the day I heard on the radio that Hugo Chavez died. I was in the car, I pulled off the side of the road, and I cried. I said, I don't think you know much about Hugo Chavez. We're talking about people with two different perspectives. There's probably going to be people listening to this and saying, Charlie Hardy is all wrong. I mean, Hugo Chavez was a horrible dictator and so on down the line. And there's two different perspectives. One time an indigenous person in Venezuela said to me, have you ever been in a country where people love their president the way we love our president? And at that moment I couldn't think of anyone, but I couldn't think of anyone who was as hated as Hugo Chavez was either.
Dependent on the neighborhood, dependent on the background.
Yes. Yeah. And when you look at demonstrations today, they can show maybe 100,000, maybe more people supporting Juan Guaido. But if you look, it's largely people with white skin. If you look at those in favor of the government, it's largely darker skin or colored skin. Yeah. And that doesn't mean that everyone in the barrio liked Chavez. They didn't. I mean, it's a free country. And even today, you can find examples of people one way or the other on things. But the representation we get in the United States is extremely lopsided in all the media. I'm going to mention all the media, even public radio, public television. Yeah. Well, part of what seems to be missing is the reason. I mean, they may tell us that there's people that support Maduro or don't, but they will argue that it's, well, the government has given all of these handouts to the population, and that was the idea. The U.S. has sanctions, and they won't be able to give handouts, and then people will come to their senses. So again, I just wonder what the conditions were that changed during that 15, 20-year period before the sanctions started, when the oil prices were at more than $100 a barrel, and the money was used for the social fund. So why would the people love Chavez
what were some tangible things that happened with food? You mentioned 2.5 million houses, but what about food? What about participation? What about the media?
In general, I mean, so many changes. Freedom of the press, there's never been freedom of the press as there is today and as came about during Chavez's time, even though they constantly said there wasn't freedom of the press. Oh, Lord, there was, that we'd never seen before. People, the whole thing of if you were to get sick and you could be taken care of free in a hospital in Venezuela. You could get your doctorate if you wanted to in the university there. Now, people say that was always true before. It was true before, but there wasn't access. A number of new universities were established. In recent times, now, the situation in Venezuela right now is very difficult, very difficult.
So we have these changes, free university, more universities, more housing, more health care. Then why are conditions so bad? Is it that Maduro took over and everything just went haywire and he doesn't know what he's doing? I mean, because despite some progress, there seems to be some serious problem. I mean, they lost their power a few days ago, so that all of the lights went out. That again, I think Rubio said, well, that shows that Maduro can't run the country. So why do we have these conditions now that would lead some to believe there's a humanitarian crisis?
On power, there was a Stratfor analysis back in 2009 that said if you eliminate power for a short time, it will be possible to overthrow Chavez. And now, 10 years later, that's one of the things that happened. I'm not here to say that President Nicolas Maduro is a perfect president. And as far as corruption goes, I know there's corruption. There's always been corruption, and with oil and so on, there's maybe more than ever. But at the same time, going to jump ahead just for a second, what right do we in the United States have to say how Venezuela should solve their problems or who their president should be and so on? We don't have the right to intervene that way. But in 2015, President Obama declared Venezuela as a threat to our national security. And that is the first step toward declaring sanctions. And how do sanctions work? Let's say you have a bank account, I presume, a credit card. Let's say tomorrow you need $1,000 to buy some medicine for your wife or some family member. You go to the bank and they say, oh yes, you have that money here, but we're not going to let you have it. So you try to use your credit card and they say, oh, sorry, we're not letting you, you have good credit. But something of that same thing is happening with the sanctions of the United States. Venezuela wants to buy medicine from Germany, for example. They have $1.5 billion in England, but England will not let them have that money because they're saying Guaido is the president. This is an illegitimate government and so on. And so they're not able to get the money for things that they would like to make available to the people.
So the sanctions mean there's less access to food or medicine or...
It's making life much more
even
difficult.
production of...
But I heard a woman on Fox News say that millions are starving in Venezuela. I may be totally wrong, but I'm going to say this. When I think of someone starving, I think of a person skin and bones
Something
on a
like
bed
in Yemen.
waiting to die. Yes. And I'm going to say there is no one starving in Venezuela, okay? People look a bit thinner to me and so on, but as far as starving to death, no. It's a big media show. Then you have things like the United States sending military airplanes with food supplies to cross the border into Colombia. And the Venezuelan government was accused by John Bolton and others of setting 2 of these big trucks on fire, 2 of these semis. Well, I looked at it and I said, those trucks are still in Colombia. How is that possible? But that was a story that kept going, and finally the New York Times has said, no, it was not the government. It was opposition people throwing Molotov cocktails that happened to set these big, what do you call them, semi-trucks on fire. I saw pictures of Colombian kids climbing up on these other trucks and throwing food down to their friends. The mayor of Cucuta in Colombia has said, please, the government isn't taking care of us.
I understand the Red Cross and the United Nations did not participate in that.
Because they said it's being used for it's a political show, it's not humanitarian needs. But there is the question, some would say, Maduro wasn't legitimately elected, or there was problems with the election or something. He was elected in May of 2018 with over 6 million votes, 67% of the vote and so on. And one can say, oh, there were problems here, problems there, or whatever. But again, what right do we in the United States have to talk about election process in other countries? Jimmy Carter, by the way, said that at that time, some years ago, of the 90 electoral processes that the Carter Center had observed throughout the world, Venezuela had the finest process they'd ever seen. Right now, when you go, you put your thumb on an electronic reader, you then vote, and you get a printout of your voting. You deposit that, so there's a paper trail of every vote that can be checked against the computer. I think there's 6 states in the United States where there is no paper trail, and many more counties where there's none. And so to question that election, when I ran for the Senate in 2014, I was a Democratic candidate from Wyoming. My opponent had $3.5 million that came from oil companies, coal companies, pharmaceutical companies. I think 98% came from outside the state of Wyoming. We raised 60,000 something. It was $1 here, $5 here, all from individuals. The Democratic Party, we got $300 from one county commission, 50 from another. But otherwise, was that a fair election? I'm just saying, I was the Democratic candidate, here's the Republican candidate. Was that a fair election? When one person has $3.5 million for the campaign, the other has like 60. Who are we to criticize? And we are the laughingstock of the world. People always say, how is it possible that the person who gets the most votes loses the election? Heard that Clinton got 3 million more votes and still lost the election. How does that happen? We have no right to be interfering in other countries with their election process and how they're running the government.
We don't have a lot of time left, but maybe you could talk about the Constituent Assembly versus the National Assembly, because I understand Guaido says because he was the head of the National Assembly, which is not really an elected position even, he's the interim president, which even the New York Times doesn't tell us what the Constitution says.
I brought with me a copy of the Constitution. You can see it's pretty well worn. It's really a beautiful document. There's no sexist language anywhere in it. It says the male president, female president, and so on down the line. There's a section here where it says if the president dies or he's mentally incompetent and physically incompetent and so on, then eventually, they can call for the president.
The vice president is supposed to
the vice president takes over,
not,
yes,
not somebody that.
No, but what has happened is there's a rotation of power. The party that Juan Guaido represents has only about, I think, 17% of the Congress or so, and they rotate who will be president. And so he just kind of fell into that the beginning of January. The first person is in house arrest, I think. The second person is out of the country, the third person. So suddenly he's the president of the assembly, and January 23rd he announces, I am now the president of Venezuela.
So we have sanctions from the U.S. that are costing $30 million a day. $30 million a day is like $1 billion a year. And then they're offered $20 million in humanitarian aid that the Red Cross doesn't recognize as humanitarian aid, all under the auspices of a man that was not elected to his position in the National Assembly, which is a body that is not recognized by the Constitution once there's a constituent assembly. But yes, this plays out in the media. It sounds to me like maybe we need more cowboys in Caracas than we've already had. So.
And I do worry a real conflict could become another Vietnam or another Syria. I am really very worried with what U.S. policy will be with regard to Venezuela.
Are you planning to go back anytime soon?
Oh, sure. I mean, when? I don't know. The temptation is to go back tomorrow, but I do. Last year I was probably back and forth maybe 3 times or 4 times. And I do carry the people. If I walk down the street in Caracas, there's probably 10,000 people who would recognize me, but they're barrio people. I lived there amongst them, and I'm worried if bombing should start or war should start. I worry. I carry them here in my heart.
Well, I think that the people that watch our show will be blessed to have a different perspective from someone that was there that had good reasons for being there, and to some small extent it may balance out the media coverage that we've had. So.
And I feel I was born in Venezuela. I was 40-something at the time, but I was born
A new
there.
life, yes. Well, I'm sorry, Charlie, that's all the time we have on our program. I want to thank Charlie Hardy for joining me today on Roundtable Perspective. I'm Lee Artz. See you next time.